The end of humanity, everything around was covered with snow. Mason and Max moved through the endless snowy desert. Even though they were warmly dressed and well-equipped, the frost penetrated them to the bones. Not far from them, a lonely frozen tree could be seen, near which was the silhouette of a man. They came closer and closer, and it was clear that the silhouette of a man was tied with a rope to a tree. Max assumed that this man ended his life by hanging. Mason took a closer look at the silhouette and said that it is really very difficult to survive in such conditions, so he understands his action like no one else. They had already approached almost densely and began to hear the silhouette of a man growling loudly and displeasedly. A crashed helicopter lay near a tree, and next to it, a frozen head and hand were sticking out from under the snow. Max was surprised and asked Mason to look at the shape of the protruding corpse. He was wearing General's shoulder straps. However, for a very long time, judging by the decomposed body, it was not a general but a rotting piece of living meat. Mason had already aimed his machine gun at him, but Max took out his knife and said that he would deal with it himself. He walked up to the former general growling at him, quietly asked for forgiveness, and stuck his knife right into his head. After that, Max suddenly took out his knife. The general's body no longer made more than one sound. However, behind them, near a tree, a case suddenly opened. He began to repeat over and over again the phrase that the respondent's biometric signal was not recorded. Mason immediately turned around, since it was the first time he had seen some kind of security system go off after killing another zombie. Without thinking for a long time, Mason began to move towards the computer, but in front of him there was another dead obstacle. The soldier hanging from the tree was ready to pounce on him and tear him to pieces if the noose around his neck had not greatly hampered him. This was not a very pleasant sight. The zombie pulled the rope with his neck and tried to break away from the tree, but he clearly did not have enough strength to do this, because the rope held his spine tightly. Mason brought his machine gun right under the head of the hanged zombie, after which he fired one accurate shot, muffled by the zombie's head. The zombie's blood sprayed directly onto Mason, and he was able to cover himself with his hand in time. At the same moment, the hanged zombie toppled over and fell onto the snow. Max asked if Mason was okay. To his question, Mason simply nodded his head, and at the same time threw off the collar, with the help of which he was pulling a sled with provisions and their things. Mason approached the case and began to examine the documents that were in it. In addition to the documents, the case contained a chip that most likely belonged to the general whom Max had just killed. It was written on the chip that it was from the capital's defense command bunker, which could be used in the event of the end of the world for high-ranking people. Mason carefully examined the key on which a long code was written. Could it really be the key to that same capital defense bunker? Mason couldn't believe his eyes. Mason put the key in the inner pocket of his jacket and said that first they should head towards the Capital Defense Command. At best, they will arrive in 10 days. Suddenly, the snow began to move away from under Mason's feet. It was an avalanche. Mason managed to shout to Max not to come closer, and in an instant, Mason, along with a suitcase of documents and their personal belongings, began to fall down. It was a small snowfall, and Mason found himself on the road a little covered in snow. He did not lose consciousness and began to try to get up. A car door suddenly began to open near him. A frozen black zombie hand immediately fell out of it. Mason quickly stood up and took a fighting stance, because the zombies would not wait until he recovered from the fall. Mason began to silently beg the zombies to sit inside and not crawl out. However, having smelled fresh human living meat, they could not just continue to sit in the snow-covered car. Under the onslaught of zombies, the car door suddenly swung open. They were hungry as never before, and their teeth chattered incessantly like animals. Mason looked at them in horror and was clearly not happy that they managed to get out. The zombie teenagers quickly began to move towards Mason. He couldn't believe his eyes. These were children. This was not easy for a living, conscious person to experience. Even though they were zombies, they still looked like children. Mason charged his machine gun. The children had already started running towards him. Mason took aim and was ready to start shooting. He decided not to open fire until they reached him. But they were driven only by the thirst to satisfy their food needs. All that remained of humanity in these zombies was the appearance of small children who once lived joyfully and carefree. Mason understood this very well and nevertheless began to shoot at them while simultaneously asking them not to approach. Since the zombies were not very tall, they moved much faster and more agile. The girl was hit in the head by a bullet and immediately fell into the snow. But the boy was even smaller than her, and Mason was only able to hit him on the body, and the bullets tore off his arm. But the little zombie had already rushed at Mason. He stopped shooting and started using the machine gun as a shield against the baby zombie. The kid grabbed the machine gun with his teeth and chewed on it, constantly trying to reach Mason's face. He looked straight at him and asked the baby zombie to stop. A trembling from what was happening ran through Mason's whole body. He had never imagined seeing something like this before, just as he had never killed such small zombies before. Mason decided that it was time to end this no matter the cost and threw the little zombie aside. The zombie baby fell on the snow a few meters from Mason. Mason said only one phrase: "The living must remain alive." Without keeping him waiting for long, the zombie baby rushed at Mason again. He pointed his machine gun at him and again said that the living must live and began to pull the trigger. However, no shot was fired. Mason looked down at his machine gun. He didn't have much time left. He pulled the bolt and it became clear that the cartridge was jammed in the barrel. He managed to quickly eliminate the delay and raised his machine gun again. The baby zombie was already a meter away from him and rushed at the machine gun. The muzzle of the machine gun rested directly on the baby zombie's only eye. At the same moment, Mason pulled the trigger and the machine gun fired. The sound of an M16 machine gun shot, muffled by the zombie's head, sounded again. The shot sent the baby zombie flying several meters away. Mason began to breathe quickly, reassuring himself that everything was over. He stood in the middle of huge snow caps and looked at the bodies of zombie kids, who now did not make more than one sound. And all around you could only hear how quickly snowflakes were falling to the ground. Max asked Mason whether he should stay at the top or should he go down and help. Mason told Max to be ready to go out, but not to come down. He will collect the papers and quickly go up to him. Mason was collecting papers when he suddenly began to hear the cracking of ice under his feet. Mason was not the only one above who heard the crack of ice, but also zombies floating under the ice. Without listening to Mason, Max began to descend from the mountain. Mason slowly and calmly put the papers back into the case and again reminded Max that he had ordered him to stay upstairs. However, Max began to dust himself off and said that he could not stand aside and was ready to help. Mason picked up the case and the machine gun and began to quickly move back to the top. He told Max to look at his feet because they were standing on the water. They urgently needed to evacuate. The situation now was not the best that could happen to them. Mason began to move towards Max, when suddenly Max was attacked from behind. He didn't have time to do anything when another zombie attacked him from behind from the snow and bit him in the neck. Mason stopped and couldn't believe that Max was so unlucky after what they went through together. Mason understood that Max would now also become a zombie and began to slowly raise his machine gun. Max was already being chewed by several zombies, and he was screaming in pain and begging Mason to shoot him. Max was almost completely pulled into the abyss of zombies, and his screams could be clearly heard around him. A tear quickly rolled down Mason's cheek. He was not ready to lose his soldier. Gritting his teeth, Mason decided to ease his suffering and shot him in the head. The sound of the shot immediately attracted zombies who ate Max. Mason immediately realized this and started running. In the snow, he began to quickly climb up the slope. Grabbing the roots of a lonely tree, he climbed up step by step because only death awaited him below. He perfectly understood that he could either fall through the ice or the zombies would eat him just like Max. There was no turning back. After a few minutes of difficult climbing up the snowy mountain, he still managed to reach the top. He cried, looked down, and could not come to terms with the death of his partner. He should have been more vigilant, he said to himself. However, Mason had no time to grieve. He again took the rope, with which he pulled the sled with provisions and clothes. He quickly threw the rope over himself and began to run. It was necessary to run as quickly as possible and as far away from this place as possible. Many years have passed since those events. Mason was still walking in the harness and pulling the sled with his things. Now Mason was walking along Seoul Olympic Route Street, building 448. At the same moment, on the same street, several people were hiding in a dilapidated building. The traveler and his wife sat indoors and said that they did not understand that the owner of this secluded corner managed to survive in such conditions. The owner was making coffee and began his story by saying that he was simply lucky. Once upon a time, they had their own bee apiary, where he and his wife spent all their time. That day, they were just collecting honey. They noticed that the bees were behaving strangely, as if they had gone mad. What was happening looked like the queen bee had decided to eradicate her swarm. The bees attacked each other and circled in mortal combat. At some point, the sky became covered with black clouds, after which, with great speed and intensity, huge stones began to fall from the sky. Such a terrifying sight they had never seen before. They had no time to think. The owner, whose name was Tom, grabbed his numb wife by the hand and ran to the dugout with supplies. When they were already sitting in the dugout, the sky, the earth, and in general, everything around shook and hummed loudly, as if everything had plunged into chaos. They were tossed from side to side like little toy dolls. It was very scary. At that moment, they prayed to whoever they could, the Lord, Buddha, and Allah. Tom turned with a smile on his face, 2 ready-made cups of coffee in his hands, and said that it was luck that helped them stay alive that day, and still does not leave him. Tom put the cups on the table and asked the guest to drink their coffee quickly before it got cold. The traveler began to warm his hands on the cups and asked if it was real coffee, because coffee is a very rare drink, and also 2 cups. Tom smiled cheerfully and asked the guest not to think about it, but just enjoy the drink. The traveler held a still hot cup of coffee in his hands and quietly said that he had not inhaled such a pleasant smell for many years. Tom looked at the traveler with sparkling eyes and waited for him to drink coffee. He quietly whispered that man is such an animal, that if he is filled with the desire to live, he will find a way to survive. Tom grinned and, reflecting, said that travelers from different parts of the planet often visit him, exchange various things with him, and he always has something to offer in return, mainly food, of course. The traveler's wife, warming her hands on a cup of coffee, said that they were very lucky that they were able to get to Seoul. She asked Tom what kind of things he makes for resale. Tom nodded his head affirmatively and said that even in this lost world, you need to do something and survive. She said that she knew a little about needlework and could help Tom create new things for resale. Emily, with all her soul and open heart, wanted to help Tom with at least something. Because he was so kind to them, he let them in, warmed them up, and even gave them coffee. Her husband put his hand on her shoulder and asked her to stop, because it was not nice say so. After all, they are seeing Tom for the first time. Suddenly, he has his own business secrets that he would not want to share with the first people he meets. Emily immediately stopped and apologized to Tom. She just wanted to express her gratitude for his friendliness. Tom smiled and said that there was nothing wrong with that. He liked such good, energetic people. The traveler took a closer look at Tom and said that he had often seen a smile like Tom's. It looked very familiar. Tom took out 2 flashlights from the cabinet and said that he often hears this from guests. Most likely he inherited the smile from his uncle, or maybe even from his mother. Well, since they want to settle here, Tom decided to show them his pride. She began to tap the flashlight on his hand and said that in order to survive, they must first study the local market. The truth is, I do unusual things. Tom suggested that the guests demonstrate everything live, so as not to beat around the bush. Tom, with a smile on his face, said that he would make an exception for them. And while they were looking at his pride, he asked Emily to wash the dishes, to which she certainly agreed and got to work. They began to go down to the basement together, and with each step it became darker and darker. Tom turned on his flashlight. He slowly descended and turned to the traveler with disbelief and said that he didn't even know whether he should show his treasures, to which the traveler began to beg him to demonstrate what had helped Tom survive for so long in this post-apocalyptic world. They went down for a long time, and the traveler said that most likely Tom was really creating something extraordinary since it was hidden so deep below. Tom and the traveler went into the basement and said that he didn't seem to be doing anything special, but for one such thing, people were ready to shell out everything they had just to buy it. As soon as they entered, the traveler was stunned by what he saw. Were there really live pigs there? Tom said it was just material. And here is what Tom talked about from the very beginning, something that is so valued in the current world. On the table, there were canned meats in huge quantities, one on top of the other, and even resembled a store shelf. Tom said that these are not just canned goods, they are made from selected meat. The traveler approached them and told Tom that he had not eaten canned food for several years. In the current world, it was like gold. Tom took off his jacket, started putting on gloves, and said that lately, because of the damned zombies, fresh flesh has not been found. Tom stood near his table with tools and chose. The traveler said that he and his wife tried to eat wild animals, but most of them were rotten inside. And these pigs looked very clean and well-fed. The traveler said that his request might sound shameless, but maybe he could take one can and share it with his wife. When the traveler turned around, Tom stood behind him, already dressed in a waterproof apron for cutting meat, and in his hands was a hammer. He quietly said that the traveler really had no shame or conscience. The traveler was frightened. He immediately asked again what Tom answered him. Tom said that the traveler has no shame. The traveler looked at Tom and asked why he took the hammer. Tom, with a smile on his face, said that the traveler was saying some nonsense. How, in his opinion, did he make so much canned food, really from a couple of precious pigs? He only adds 20% pork to his canned food, but the remaining 80 are completely different meat. The traveler understood everything. He began to back away with fear in his eyes and cold sweat on his face. He retreated further and further back when suddenly he ran into something with his back. Turning around, he saw the secret ingredient that Tom added to his canned food. The traveler remembered where Tom's smile was so familiar to him from. At the same moment, the hammer hit the target with great speed and blood sprayed from the head. The pigs immediately began to rush around the room and squeal loudly. A few drops of blood fell on Tom's face. He looked at the traveler lying on the floor and waited to see if he could finish speaking, or if one blow was enough. The traveler, choking on blood, said, "Tom, Tom the Ripper." Tom was even a little happy that he had once gained popularity. He turned around and loudly called Emily to come downstairs. He again loudly asked her to come down, and heard that she was quickly going down the stairs. The smile did not leave Tom's face, because now he had enough meat for a new portion of canned food. The basement was filled with the smell of fresh blood. Drops of blood were dropped one by one into a bucket on the floor. Tom stood near the bucket and said out loud that he still doesn't understand why the little people strive to get to Seoul. Tom, like many maniacs, loved to talk to himself. He said that it was also better for him that people were going in droves to Seoul. It was becoming easier and easier for him to handle the farm. He asked Emily why she was looking at him with that look. Was she really offended by being hung next to a pig? Just look at your body, how you differ from a pig. It's just 1-to-1. Look here at the fillet, here at the sirloin, and here at this lard. And there are 2 eyes too. The same pair of ears. And the blood is exactly the same scarlet. In a word, people are like pigs. Suddenly, the bell rang upstairs. Tom got a little angry. Even though you install cameras at your workplace, as soon as the meat arrives, they immediately start ringing. The stationary radio standing on the barrel made hissing sounds. Tom took the radio and said that the butcher shop was on the line. They told him that the car they were talking about they had. A battery with a manganese battery, there were 12 of them. This made Tom happy. He praised the person on the other end of the line and asked when they would send him the order. The man replied that this time the goods were difficult to get, so he could exchange them for 30 cans. Tom was indignant, because 30 cans is a real robbery. The man on the radio said that his boss Kim was visiting in a couple of weeks, so they ordered him to prepare something worthwhile no matter what. Tom got angry. What birthday is it? So many years ago the calendar disappeared. What birthday can we talk about? Tomorrow they can come for 20 cans and I don't care about the rest. The radio was silent for a short time, and a minute later it hissed again. The person on the other end said that tomorrow he would send people for delivery, and who would be sent with them. Tom smiled again and said that he liked the new young girls, Amanda and Becca. But the man on the radio said that they also needed them. It was very inconvenient to constantly send him 2 girls, so he would only send 1. This did not suit Tom. He said that everyone wants to eat meat, and now they decided to play masters with him. He got angry in a second and started shouting into the walkie-talkie. Tom said that he could come to them himself and restore order in their hierarchy. Tom roared like an animal that had not received its prey. He said that he was ready to come to them and divide them into people and cattle. Maybe this way their brains would fall into place, and they would finally understand who could be refused and who could not. If they want to live, then they shouldn't contradict Tom. He was filled with rage. He tried to calm down a little and threw the radio away, stopped, and exhaled a little. Then he picked up the radio again and calmly announced that this was the end of the message. The radio was silent for about a minute, and finally the man said that tomorrow he would send 2 girls along with the package. This suited Tom. He turned off the radio. How dare they even argue with him? The tension turned into a headache. Tom thought that it would be nice to visit them and dance the knife dance so that they would not forget who the real boss is here. No, we need to think positive today, Amanda and Becca. Tom decided to go to bed early today in order to properly relieve tension tomorrow. Mason was watching Tom through the optical sight. He zoomed his sight closer and further out to understand how he knew this place so well. Mason remembered this place and realized that he had finally arrived in Seoul. He wondered what kind of person it was who single-handedly privatized this huge building. If only this person turned out to be good, Mason still needs to find out a lot about the situation happening in Seoul. Mason did not dare to immediately go to the discovered person. First, he should watch him. If everything looks safe, then you can go to this person. On the other hand, Mason saw a half-sunken huge cruiser. It's time to look for a place to stay for the night. Mason, crunching his soles in the snow, went inside the ship. He examined the ship from the inside. There are many windows in the guest rooms. If even a weak light leaks out, Mason will expose himself to danger, both from passing zombies and from living people. In truth, zombies, of course, scared Mason a lot. But he was much more afraid of the living, because they have intelligence. After a few minutes of wandering around the ship, Mason came across the men's room. Still, there is no safer place than the toilet, Mason thought. However, since the ship was upside down, the toilet was above Mason's head. On some level, this was good. Mason, without thinking for a long time, took the flashlight into his mouth and began to climb. Taking into account the fact that it was necessary to lift all the things, it took a little longer than expected. But this was not the first time Mason was in such a situation, and within 5 minutes, he was in the toilet with his things. He slowly began to climb the partitions of the booths to the very top. Having climbed up, he began to tap the ceiling of the toilet. Naturally, in the new location, it was necessary to provide a bladeless escape route. Another winter day full of snow and cold has arrived. Zombies, like everywhere else, wandered around Seoul in search of fresh meat. This zombie's attention was drawn to the unusual sound of the engine, causing it to growl loudly as the sound quickly approached. As soon as the sound reached its approaching volume, the zombie's head flew off his shoulders. Then she rolled down, plastering the surrounding snow on herself. It was one of the gang's followers who rushed past the zombies on a snowmobile. Immediately behind him rushed the second follower of the gang, who, just like the first, stuck his sword into the zombie. However, the sword broke, and part of it remained stuck in the frozen zombie. The next guy, flying behind them on a snowboard, decided not to stand aside and take a ride on the zombies. He landed on her back and rolled over her like a snowy mound. However, the sword sticking out of it continued to ride with him. He began to scream like crazy, considering that a fragment of a sword was sticking out of his leg. The boss driving behind them in the car just laughed because of what had happened. Amanda and Becca were riding in the car with sad faces. They all moved straight towards the building that belonged to Tom. When they drove far enough, Mason got out of the covered snow. None of the bandits even suspected that Mason was watching them. Mason watched what was happening, and he became increasingly convinced that Seoul posed a huge threat, not just because of the huge number of zombies, but also because of the huge number of surviving psychopaths. The bandits stopped at the entrance to the building, turned off their motorcycles, and began to wait for Tom's arrival. The guy who ran over the blade of the knife was barely hobbling and could not put his foot on his feet. He said that first he needed to patch himself up at the old man's house, and only then the rest of the things. At that moment, Tom went outside from his house and drew the attention of the young guy that no one allowed him to do this. He started shouting at the old man and said that he could look at his leg himself. Doesn't such an injury require urgent treatment? Tom didn't think for a long time and said that he could help him if the boy had a problem in his leg. Tom suggested cutting it off at the ankle. But if the problem is in the brains, which send pain signals, then Tom could well cut off somewhere up to the neck so that they would not interfere. The boy took his butterfly knife out of his pocket and pointed it at Tom and said that the old man had completely lost his head. If he imagines himself to be a big shot because the guys paid him, then he can solve this problem with one blow. At that very second, Tom took out his huge knife from his bosom and stuck it right to the boy's throat. Tom said that he would give just 3 seconds so that those who should not stay here would disappear. The guy only had time to swallow his saliva from the fear of final reprisal. There was 1 second left. Tom smiled with all his teeth, and at that moment he looked like an obsessed maniac. He said that he would keep his scalp as a present. At that moment, another bandit grabbed the boy by the hood and threw him sharply back, shouting that if he forgot, their task was only to deliver the order. The bandit apologized to Tom for his friend, and in his defense, said that the boy had not participated in forays for a long time and could not distinguish shit from urine. Tom rubbed his huge knife on his forearm and said that if this fellow was so clumsy, he might have nothing to live for, and he could quickly deal with him if his friends didn't have the courage to do it. The bandit said that they shouldn't do this. This kid might still be useful to them. At this moment, the boy tried to get to his feet, but the guy who was shielding him in front of Tom sharply swung his leg back and hit him right in the head. The blow sent the boy flying a few meters away from Tom, and the bandit said that he would make sure that Tom never saw him as a messenger again. Tom began to smile and wave his knife, expressing denial. He asked to send this little guy to him one more time, and then he would definitely be able to count how many bones there were in his little body. Tom grinned at the boy with all his teeth and warned him that this would not be their last meeting. The girl stood a little to the side. Tom looked at them and said that they had nothing to fear. He was always happy with these two, and they can come to visit him even without an invitation. The bandit said that they would return for them tomorrow at the same time. Tom tapped the snowmobile with a knife and offered to send them on his own tomorrow if they left him one snowmobile. The bandit said that they couldn't do that because they could get into trouble if these girls took a wrong turn. The old man grinned and said that he would try to finish with them quickly, after which he disappeared into the darkness of the building. At that moment, a boy with a sword in his leg stood up from the snow. His name was Scott. Scott got up and asked what it was all about. But he didn't even have time to fully finish his sentence when the bandit grabbed him by the mouth and ordered him to shut up. He threatened that if Scott ever opened his mouth again without his permission, he would be immediately demoted to a slave. Scott said through clenched teeth that he understood everything and apologized. The bandit abruptly released him and threw him into the snow. Within a few minutes, everyone was distributed on snowmobiles and went to their base. Meanwhile, the girls and Tom went into his room. They understood perfectly well what they would have to do now, although not one of them wanted it, but they had absolutely no choice. And they were already accustomed to the fact that in the gang they were used simply for carnal pleasures, and sometimes they had to pay the price for the purchase of any goods. Tom was filled with a feeling of excitement. He liked it when girls were defenseless and unquestioningly followed his orders. He pointed his finger at Amanda and ordered her to come closer to him. Pointing the knife at the second one, he ordered her to go to the second floor and cut some meat with it. Amanda had been to Tom more than once and began to whisper to Becca what she should do. However, Tom quickly approached them and asked what they were doing here. They came here together to please each other. He put a knife in Amanda's hands and said that if his mood was ruined today, then who would have to bear responsibility for it? Tom looked at Amanda, who clearly understood what his words meant. She was afraid to move and quietly said that he was certainly right. Tom pushed Amanda away and ordered her to go to the second floor and cut up the meat. Afterwards, he told her that he would get up soon and she shouldn't miss him. He turned around and looked at Becca, who was confused and didn't know what she could expect from him. Tom beckoned her with his finger, but she did not come up, but grabbed her fingers tightly into the table, and out of fear, she simply could not tear them away from the table. Even when they were driving here in the car, Amanda warned Becca that under no circumstances should she contradict him. It's best to just free your thoughts and imagine yourself as a zombie who will do whatever he's told. Resistance turns him on even more, and if she doesn't react in any way, he'll leave sooner. At that moment, Becca simply listened silently to her friend, but did not even imagine what awaited her. Tom roughly grabbed her by the hair, turned her back to him, and forced her head into the table. This made the girl cry out in pain, and Tom pressed himself against her buttocks. He leaned over her and began to smell her. He whispered quietly in her ear that he had only smelled the smell of meat for a month. But when he inhales the scent of a young girl, he simply enjoys it. With a huge smile on his face, he said that he really wanted to kill her. At this time, the bandits were driving to the base. Scott was unhappy with the situation. He turned to Henry and said that he did everything he was told to do, but if he continued to be beaten and humiliated in front of the slaves' eyes, then in the future, they would not take him seriously at all. These dogs won't even listen then. Before he had time to finish this, a new blow from Henry landed on his nose. Scott immediately coughed and grabbed his face with both hands. The driver asked not to fill his car with blood, because it would be difficult to clean it later. The driver threw a napkin at Scott and said that even if he received one badge, this does not mean at all that he can now go where he doesn't need to go. Henry hovered over Scott and asked him to listen carefully. Once upon a time, the bastard Tom was a policeman, and with a very bad character. But Tom was not just a policeman. He caught not only criminals, he also kept all ordinary people in fear. He was famous for his cruelty to everyone who surrounded him. If he didn't like the person's appearance, then something would happen at home, so he was exiled to the provinces. However, in the village he began to drink a lot, and one day he massacred the entire village. Then the number of those killed exceeded 30 people. In general, he went completely crazy. It's better not to touch this mad dog. He's a real psycho. Scott wiped the blood coming from his nose and asked if Tom was such a psychopath. Then why haven't they killed him yet? Henry said that a more correct question here is why they still haven't killed him, continue to make deals and sometimes even grovel, as happened now. The answer to this question is very simple. He is a real zombie killer. Here in the vicinity of Seoul, there are 3 legendary psychos, as there are rumors in the basements of the prison. There is a surviving group of prisoners. It was rumored that these 3 had already caught hundreds of thousands of zombies. If you listen to those who climb to them from the lower regions, you can hear from them stories about how the snow begins to melt, and zombies come out from under the snow to hunt in whole flocks. And here you don't need to think for long. Soon hordes of zombies will rush up straight for food. Seoul is their final destination one way or another. And Tom, even though he's crazy, even though he's a killer, if he helps defend the city from zombies, then they can only thank him. So tomorrow, when they go to pick up the girls, there's no point in even breathing in Tom's direction. You just need to silently pick up the girls and leave. Scott understood everything and apologized to Henry. Henry said that Scott doesn't bother him. He's worried about Tom, from whom you can expect anything. He's as kind as he is today only when he's killing. A new day arrived, and the guys were driving to Tom's house to pick up the girls. They drove closer and closer and saw 2 silhouettes standing on the street. The girls had been standing on the street for several hours. They didn't know where to go, but they didn't want to go back to Tom, even if it cost them their lives. Becky's hand was all cut up with a knife. This complete psycho took up his task again. He couldn't just enjoy the girl. He was turned on by screams, torment, and bullying. All this time, Mason spent the night on the ship and watched what was happening. Now he was more prepared for the sudden appearance of people or zombies. He hung bells around the entire perimeter. A rope with bells hung both at the entrance and in the elevator shaft. Everything around was quite quiet, and there were no signs of trouble. However, the peace did not last as long as we would have liked. Zombies with red eyes were advancing in droves. Bells were ringing everywhere. One by one, they made sounds of approaching danger. But Mason was fast asleep. He did not hear any of them. No one had attacked him in the middle of the night for a long time, especially since the last 2 nights passed quite calmly, and it seemed that the ship was completely empty. He slept soundly and quietly chanted the words that, in secret from others, he wandered, shedding tears. Mason dreamed of his military base called Eagle. Mason was a tank driver and his rank was sergeant. When he arrived again from his next training trip, the lieutenant asked him about his date with the girl today. The lieutenant told Mason that his girlfriend was already in the waiting room and could not wait for him. Mason thanked the lieutenant for the information and quickly began to get ready to see his girlfriend. 5 minutes later, he reached the meeting room. His girlfriend did not behave as usual. She sat stiffly and was not at all happy about their conversation. She said that she would no longer come to him. Mason looked at her in surprise and did not understand why she was doing this. What happened? She couldn't find the right words. She said that she had wanted to tell him for a long time, but couldn't bring herself to do it. She was afraid to upset him, because now he was not having the easiest time until he reached the rank of corporal. And because of this, many people grab weapons and, God forbid, desert. She didn't even look at him and said it as if to the floor. Mason said with a smile that he doesn't shoot a pistol. He's a tanker. The girl looked into his eyes with hope and asked if he could understand her. Mason, without losing his composure, said that everything was clear here. Let everyone live their own lives. The girl immediately supported him and said that he had always been like this. He didn't need anything. That's probably why they should break up. Mason began to adjust his cap and asked her not to start making this conversation worse, and if they were to break up, then perhaps they should break up on a good note. She quickly stood up and thanked him for his time with a smile. Then she slowly began to leave the room. Mason, without turning around, quietly said thank you to you too, but the girl returned and asked him to fulfill another request of hers. Mason was surprised to ask what exactly she wanted from him. Finally, she asked him to touch his head one last time. Mason said that although he is not in the mood for this, but if she really wants it, then he is not against it. She put her hand to his head, and she began to experience unusual sensations. He felt her touch as if in reality, it was completely unusual for a dream. The zombie's hand was already reaching his head. Mason slowly opened his eyes. The zombies were already at arm's length from him. One of them was able to grab his jacket and held it tightly without letting go. And at that moment, Mason was able to get up and grab his machine gun. He was very lucky. The wiring prevented the zombies from reaching him and turning him into one of their kind. Mason was sitting on a booth, and zombies were rushing towards him. The zombies made him wake up very quickly, but he did not understand how this was possible, because he checked everything. He couldn't even imagine where these creatures had come from. He didn't know what to do because this was his escape route. There were a lot of zombies, and they began to break through the ceiling. They all acted together, as if they were a single organism. This behavior was very strange, because usually they were attracted by noise or light, but here there was neither one nor the other. Mason couldn't understand how so many zombies came here together, and why their eyes glow bright red. They fell from the ceiling and fell to the bottom of the toilet. Mason looked down in order to analyze the situation and understand whether they were alive. How surprised he was when he saw that they not only did not die, but also began to crawl towards him through the booths. There were a lot of them, and they were already one step away from tearing Mason apart. He aimed his machine gun at them, but did not understand at all what to do. And at that moment, when one of the zombies had already begun to climb onto his cabin, he looked at the ventilation from where they came. Since they all fell down, it means there should no longer be more than one zombie there. Unless there are zombies near the emergency ventilation exit, he will be able to get out into the guest hall. When the theoretical plan had already been developed, all that remained was to get there. Mason ran without thinking for a long time. Having run fast enough, he jumped into the ventilation shaft. This was his only escape route. Flying over a horde of zombies, he managed to jump over and land right in the ventilation. But there too, zombies, slowly and quietly descending like spiders, were waiting for him. Mason thought only about one thing, that he would be able to survive. Quickly reaching the guest lounge, he looked down and there didn't seem to be more than one zombie there. However, behind him, he heard a growl that did not stop and was approaching. There was no choice, and he jumped from the ventilation into the guest hall. The floor there was not very strong, and he began to slide down at great speed, at the same time trying to aim at the zombies approaching him. At some point, he broke the glass of the ship with his back and now began to roll down the stern of the ship. He fell into the snow and began to aim at the window, from which came the terrible growling of the vile dead. It was very cold outside, but due to the rush of adrenaline and fear that filled Mason from his toes to his head, so far he did not feel the cold at all. Suddenly, he heard a crash under his feet. From under the ice, a dead, cold hand grabbed his leg. Another drowned zombie, whose eyes glowed red, just like the zombies from the ship. Mason looked closely and realized that huge hordes of drowned zombies were also raging under the ice, their path blocked only by solid water. For a second, he remembered his friend Max, the one with whom he had wandered together for a long time around the frozen world, before that tragic moment with the melted ice. The second hand came out right from under the snow and grabbed Mason by the leg. This zombie looked a lot like Max. Could it really be him? Using his clothes, he climbed higher and higher on Mason, and he became numb and could not move. Max told him why he abandoned him then, left him alone to die, and did not deprive him of this terrible fate. Without ceasing, he asked why he did this to him. Why? From behind, someone called out to Mason and asked him to come to his senses. Mason shook his head and realized that he was just imagining it. All the zombies continued to be under the ice. Behind Mason, there was a man who was piercing the ice with a long harpoon. He said that in such conditions, one should not lose vigilance, even though there is only a hand on the surface. But if you grab it, it is very difficult to tear it off. Mason was glad that there was at least someone alive here. The man turned to him and said that he should only beware of those zombies with bright red eyes, because they are very thoughtful and extremely dangerous guys. The man said that the ice has not melted yet. He cuts off their hands on their heads, a kind of farming. Mason apologized and said that he does not know the local customs. He came from far away and fell upon him out of the blue. The man began to take off his hat and scarf from his face, saying that there was nothing to apologize to him for. He continued to harpoon through the ice and zombie heads. The man said that apparently Mason needed somewhere to warm up, and he could offer to spend the night with him. He finally took off his mask, and he can also offer you a cup of coffee. Mason looked at the man and realized that this was exactly the man he had been watching all these days. Tom introduced himself and said that he managed to get some very good coffee. He pointed his finger where to go and waited for an answer from Mason. The cold gradually began to penetrate Mason's body. Tom looked at him and assumed that he was running away in what he had. He was probably caught by surprise, even if he had to leave his clothes. Mason scratched his head and said that he really was in trouble. Tom asked with interest if Mason had any other things that were worth coming back for. Mason, without thinking for a long time, said that old clothes were all he had. Then it's not worth risking your life for this. Tom said that he has a lot of old clothes at home and they can pick them up for Mason. Meanwhile, Mason's things were in the closet, including a machine gun hidden in his things. However, Mason thought that it was not worth talking about it right away. It would be better if it remained his little secret. Mason was now only thinking that the stranger was no less dangerous than those zombies who almost ate him half an hour ago. They quickly came to Tom's house. Tom showed Mason where to sit. It was a little warmer there than in other places in the dilapidated apartment. Before Mason had time to sit down, Tom threw him a jacket. Tom started making coffee and asked Mason how he managed to survive in such chaos, to which Mason replied that he was very cowardly, so he was able to avoid trouble. Tom asked him if there was anyone else with him, or if he had been traveling alone from the very beginning. Mason had already put on his jacket and put his machine gun on his hands. He said that his partner died a few years ago, and since then he has been traveling alone. The world is big, there are a lot of zombies everywhere, and he just had to always be careful. That's why he's still alive. Tom was making coffee and said that he most likely understood what kind of person Mason was. Mason became interested and asked Tom what he meant. Tom, without turning around, said that Mason was tiring. You turn the words of adults around. You don't listen to others. In general, you are a person with a bad character. Mason didn't immediately understand what was going on, but he immediately apologized if Tom thought he was rude. He didn't want to offend him. Tom walked up to him with a cup of coffee and said with a smile on his face that he was just joking. Mason grabbed the cup with both hands and said that he really could have been rude, because he hadn't talked to anyone for so long, and he simply could have forgotten what it was. Mason remembered Tom's words about being careful of red eyes, what he meant. Tom asked in surprise if this was the first time he had seen a zombie with red eyes. Mason said that in the places where he had been, all the zombies had ordinary eyes, or there were none at all. Tom didn't even believe him right away. Were there really no red-eyed zombies anywhere else? Mason nodded his head and said that this was the first time he had seen such zombies in Seoul. Tom thought about it because it was quite strange, but most likely Mason was just lucky. But since he is so interested in learning about red-eyed zombies, Mason, without waiting for an answer, said that he was just incredibly interested in learning more about them. But Tom scratched his head and said that maybe he shouldn't reveal such first-class information to a fool. Mason looked at Tom with pleading eyes and said that he would be very grateful for such important information. Tom liked how Mason reacted and said that such a nice boy could reveal the secret. Tom asked him to listen carefully and not interrupt, because this area used to be a zombie world. But even so, Tom said that he really wanted to get this hotel, and he is the kind of guy who gets what he wants. He gritted his teeth and killed every last one of them. However, on the subway, he had the opportunity to meet this creature for the first time in his life. The zombie stood alone on the very edge of the platform, and his eyes glowed bright red, which distinguished him from all those whom he killed that day. Then I didn't suspect anything wrong. He killed hundreds of zombies every day, and this one seemed like another obstacle to a carefree life. However, when he began to walk towards the zombie, the creature began to slowly move back. He asked Mason if he had ever seen a zombie back away at the sight of a person, to which Mason responded with surprise that he had never seen such a thing before. At that moment, when the creature began to gradually retreat, a whole herd of goosebumps ran from the tailbone to the back of the head. Over the many years of the zombie apocalypse, my senses are developing more than ever, so I stopped and thought that I shouldn't follow the creature's lead. I started to step back a little. I stepped back and looked around. In the doorway, I saw whole hordes of red-eyed creatures looking at me from the darkness. These creatures waited until I went beyond a certain line. Mason asked if these zombies were really hunting in a pack. Tom said he didn't know what they were doing, but they were clearly wiser than the average dumb zombies that wander around the world aimlessly. Tom said that even though he was running very fast, he still felt cold on his back. Just at that moment, his gaze fell on the mirror in front. These creatures behind simply stood and terribly looked at the back, not even trying to pursue. Tom said that for the first time in his life, he was so scared. And now you just need to think about what would have happened if I had gone in to kill that creature. I probably wouldn't drink coffee here, Mason concluded. Tom poured coffee into his glass and said that his hunches rarely let him down. Tom walked up to the table where Mason was sitting and asked him if he was letting go of his machine gun. It's probably just hard to trust people after so many years of loneliness. Mason looked at his machine gun and said that he felt somehow calmer with a weapon in his hands. After all, unarmed people have no choice but to trust those people who have weapons in their hands. Tom said that Mason is completely right, but armed people are not always good. Tom stood over Mason and asked him if he was good. Mason said that he couldn't say for sure. Mason said he tried to live his life trying not to hurt other people. Mason decided to change the subject and said that this coffee has a very pleasant aroma. Tom agreed with him because the past immediately comes to mind, the times when we lived well and ate well. Mason looked at the cup of coffee and said that it seemed to him that if he blinked now, he would be at home in the living room watching TV. The familiar calming aroma, yes, those were good times. Just a cup of coffee, and we are already deeply immersed in the past. Tom addressed Mason in a personal manner, and he said that he shouldn't do that because Tom is clearly quite more experienced than him. Tom said that everyone has their own time in one way or another, and the way they address each other is absolutely nothing means in the current world. Tom went to his locker and took out flashlights. He asked Mason if he wasn't interested in how he managed to survive. If anything, by going down he could get the answer to this fascinating question. Tom said he makes awesome stuff. They are very popular among the survivors, and Mason may be very surprised when he sees them. Tom beckoned him with his hand and said it wouldn't take long. Mason was in no hurry to agree. He looked at the table and saw 2 imprints from cups on it. Then he looked down into the basement again. Mason suspected something was wrong and quickly said that he was very tired and would like to get some sleep first. He apologized to Tom because he has all his heart for him. Tom turned around and said that it was okay. No need for an apology, we could go later. After that, they went to the upper floors of the hotel. Tom walked ahead, and Mason still held the weapon in his hands and was ready to use it at any moment. Mason looked down. It was quite high. Tom said that it was very dark here. Just one mistake and you could go straight to the next world. Mason said that he is used to such darkness, and he always walks with extreme caution. Then we'll part ways here, Tom said. He suggested that Mason go up the stairs to the floor above. There were many empty rooms there, and he could occupy any of them. Mason thanked Tom for taking care of him today. Tom said that it was nothing, and if they were lucky tonight, they would see each other alive tomorrow. As soon as they parted, Mason removed his left hand from the machine gun and found that it was sweating a lot, and everything inside him tightened. Still, new acquaintances are not so easy. Mason entered the first room he came across. The glass was broken, and it could hardly be called a room at all. Mason went to the window and took a closer look. There was a light in the distance. When Mason was standing near the window below, Tom shouted to him that before he lit the fire, he should fix the curtains. The fire would be of no use if the cold entered the room. Mason asked Tom if it was possible to light a fire here, to which he received an answer that there was no need to worry about it. It was quite safe here. Then Mason got to work and began fixing the curtains, after which he began to collect fire sticks lying around the room. The trouble is, he has neither a lighter nor matches. He took a stick with him and decided to ask Tom for some fire, hoping that he would not refuse it. Mason went to the door and knocked. Tom carefully opened the door and asked what else he needed. Mason handed him a stick and asked him to borrow at least a little light. The old man looked at him with displeasure, but still took the stick and went deeper into the room. Mason decided to look into the room while he was setting a stick on fire for him. It was as if there was something in the bathroom. Mason couldn't see what was there when Tom appeared. He handed him a stick with fire and said that he could repay him with more fire. With the burning stick, Mason headed to his room. The fire was already burning full blast in Mason's fireplace. He lay down next to the fire and covered himself with a carpet. After everything he had experienced that day, he urgently needed to warm up a little, because few people can constantly be in the cold and not get sick. At the same time, a girl was moving in the distance through snow-covered snowdrifts in a dark forest. The cold penetrated her body to the bones. Although she was wrapped in several things, this did not greatly save her from the constantly falling snow, darkness, and dead cold. Our Father, who art in heaven, let your name shine. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, just as we forgive our debtors. Don't lead us into your temptation, but deliver us from evil, where your kingdom is power and glory. And forever and ever, amen. This happened a long time ago. The plane was rapidly losing altitude, and they were approaching the ground at great speed. Melinda was one of the passengers on this plane. One of the engines on the plane was on fire, and a crash was inevitable. Melinda understood this very well. She quickly took out her phone and started texting her mother. Mom immediately answered her that she simply had to survive in any way. She would always be waiting for her at the specified address. She tried to call her mother, but the network was not available. At that moment, meteorites began to fly near the plane. The sister grabbed Melinda's hand. She was very scared that they would break. Melinda tried to calm her sister down and said that everything would work out for them. However, they were flying over the sea, and meteorites were flying near their plane one after another, so the burning engine was not their biggest problem. The plane crashed, but the mother wrote to her daughter that after landing, she should inject herself with the L1 vaccine. The directions for use are written on the bottle. Several years have passed. Survivors of the crash on their way meet strangers. One of them introduces himself as a pastor and tells them that he is the leader of a group of survivors. Their group is called Silent Prayer. Melinda said that they were heading to Seoul. The pastor said that he could help them. They could warm up and replenish their strength in their shelter, after which they agreed to follow him. The survivors from the pastor's team were glad that they were able to meet such young girls. One of the pastor's people asked if Melinda was in a women's music group. A couple of years ago, it would have been difficult for ordinary people to see her. The pastor said that God really smiled on them. If not God, then who prepared such a wonderful meeting for them? By that time, they had already approached the church. The pastor was opening the entrance, and at that moment, Melinda saw a tattoo on his leg. Such tattoos are worn by members of criminal gangs. This seriously confused Melinda. Something was clearly wrong here. The pastor opened the entrance to the church and asked everyone to enter. They walked along the dark corridor of the church and had almost entered the main hall. The pastor asked them not to be shy and get to know the followers of the church. Rejoice, brothers and sisters. The pastor said that he plans to get married and propose his hand and heart to the newly arrived Melinda. The bandit said that everyone should get a little bit of it. Otherwise, it's not serious. He wanted to take it all for himself at once. One of the bandits said that if he is called a shepherd, this does not mean that he has ceased to be mortal. The bespectacled bandit said that you shouldn't be so greedy. And once they specifically agreed that if they find something valuable together, then everyone should get something good. The old bandit supported. The loot should be divided among everyone and everyone should try it. At his age, there was only melancholy all around. The pastor smiled and said that if the majority was of this opinion, he would not interfere. Then first, we need to let her go in a circle. The door to their room was slightly open. Melinda stood at the door and perfectly heard the bandits discussing her future fate. She immediately ran to her sister. Melinda said that she should not be afraid of anything and should listen to her very carefully. It seems these people are not real shepherds. She held her sister by the shoulders and said that these are very scary people. Therefore, first they need to quickly get out of there. But the sister immediately asked what would happen next. If they managed to escape, then where should they go next? The girl didn't believe Melinda. She said that if they ran away, they might freeze to death on the street. Melinda said that until this time they had managed to survive, and now they will succeed. By any means, they must get to Seoul, and their mother will be waiting for them there. The girl was still wary of Melanie's words. She was very scared even without her words. Melinda said they had to do what they had to do one way or another. The girl said that the director constantly repeated these words. Melinda confirmed that the director said such nonsense all the time, but these words were more suitable for this moment than ever. She took the girl by the hand and rushed to the exit. The other survivors looked at Melinda and her sister and did not understand why they were leaving. The man suggested that something was wrong here and most likely the girls knew something, so they should go with them. One of the survivors ran towards the exit and even pushed Melinda away. From the very beginning, the presence of zombies sitting in the church was suspicious. A zombie tied with chains could still move. At that moment, when a woman ran past him, he attacked her, biting straight into her neck. Immediately, several zombies sitting nearby attacked her and began to tear her to pieces. Behind them, the pastor laughed. The pastor ordered everyone to remain in their seats. The oldest bandit looked out of the room and said that they shouldn't have moved without permission. It was he who released the zombie from the chain so that he could reach the woman and kill her. The pastor ordered the men to stand on his right side and the women on his left. One of the men asked what they were going to do with them. One of the bandits did not like that the guy was asking unnecessary questions, after which he was immediately followed by a direct kick to the stomach with an exclamation to move faster. From the blow, the guy flew straight into the clutches of the zombies. The bandit laughed and apologized for such a strong blow to the guy who had already been devoured by zombies. The pastor asked not to do this again. They need to save their workforce. Everyone around was horrified by what had happened, and the pastor reminded them that they needed to quickly follow orders. Everyone looked at the pastor with horror in their eyes. After this, the pastor ordered one bag to be distributed to everyone. The bandit threw the bags on the floor and ordered them to be sorted quickly. Everyone should take one bag and go outside and start collecting. One of the women asked what this meant because it was cold and snowing outside. Now the meaning of collecting is a little different than before. They should collect items for the household, some products that everyone will need. But the woman said that everything outside was covered with snow, where she could get useful items. The shepherd said that at the moment they are all just useless worms for their community, and how dare she even say such a thing? She looked at the zombie who was ready to attack her. Then she instantly decided that she would definitely be able to bring something needed for the community. It's better that way, and let no one even think about returning empty-handed, unless, of course, they want to join the ranks of domestic zombies. First of all, they should collect food and other essential items. But Melinda and her sister should give them a minute for a private conversation. The bandits were already looking forward to the upcoming sexual fun with these young beauties. The girls were terrified. Each of them at that moment would like to be in the place of the others and engage in collecting, and not what they had to do.